It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a few days off and drive out to a small cabin I'd rented online in northern Minnesota. I'd been working construction all summer, long hours and constant noise, and I wanted to be away from people, machines, and city lights. The cabin sat near a narrow lake, surrounded by dense pine woods that looked endless on the map. The pictures showed a rough wooden deck, a metal roof, and a small dock. It looked quiet and simple, exactly what I wanted. I reached the place in the evening after a long 6-hour drive. The sun was setting behind the trees, and the temperature had already dropped below freezing. The gravel road leading to the cabin was narrow and covered in dead leaves, and my old truck struggled to climb some of the muddy slopes. By the time I parked, the sky was already dark gray, and the wind had that sharp, cold bite that comes before winter. The cabin itself looked smaller than in the photos. Its walls were weathered, and the roof looked like it had seen years of snow. The windows were covered with condensation from the inside, and when I stepped onto the porch, the boards creaked under my boots. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine wood, dampness, and dust. There was one main room with a small kitchenette, a table, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. In the back, there was a single bedroom with a narrow bed and a small dresser. A faint smell of mice lingered in the corners. I unpacked my gear, just a duffel bag, a flashlight, a hatchet, and some canned food, and started the fire. Once the wood stove began to crackle and glow, the place felt a little less empty. That first night was quiet except for the wind pushing against the walls. I sat near the stove, reading a magazine I'd brought, until the fire burned low. When I finally turned off my flashlight, the darkness was thick. Out there, away from any town, the night felt heavy and alive. I could hear branches shifting, the faint sound of something walking through leaves somewhere far off. It didn't bother me. Forest sounds at night are normal. Animals, wind, or just the woods settling. I told myself that as I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke to a pale blue light filtering through the window. A thin layer of frost had formed on the inside of the glass. I stepped outside, breath visible in the cold air, and walked down to the lake. The surface was calm, covered in mist that rose like smoke. Across the water, the tree line looked endless, dark and silent. The ground was soft with rotting leaves, and my boots sank into the mud near the edge. I noticed something strange then. Fresh footprints, deep in the mud, leading from the trees down to the shore and back again. They weren't mine. They were larger, wider, and had been made recently. I crouched down, feeling the chill run through me. Someone had been walking here either last night or early this morning. I stood still for a while, scanning the tree line, but there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the quiet hiss of wind. I went back to the cabin, locking the door behind me even though I knew how flimsy it was. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself it was probably a hunter or some local passing through. The cabin wasn't far from public land after all. Still, I couldn't shake off that uneasy feeling. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, turning the light gray and flat. I spent the day chopping some of the stacked firewood outside and checking around the cabin. The woods felt colder that evening, quieter than before. Even the birds had stopped making noise. Around dusk, while I was bringing wood inside, I noticed something else. The back door latch looked slightly bent, as if someone had tried to pull it open. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if I had maybe slammed it too hard earlier. I hadn't. That night, I couldn't relax. Every sound stood out sharper. The wind, the branches tapping against the wall, the occasional creak of the floorboards. I kept my flashlight next to me on the nightstand, even though I didn't turn it on. At some point, I heard something faint outside, like slow footsteps on the porch. The boards creaked once, then again, then stopped. I stayed still in bed, holding my breath. A few minutes passed before I heard the soft thud of something brushing against the door. Then silence again. I didn't move for hours. When daylight finally came, I checked the porch. There were muddy prints there, faint but visible, leading up to the door and then back down the steps. The prints were barefoot. That detail froze me more than anything else. No shoes, no boots, just wide, human-like feet pressed into the wood, with the toes clearly outlined in the dried mud. The air felt heavier, and I suddenly wanted nothing more than to leave. But the nearest town was nearly 20 miles away, and I didn't want to drive through the forest roads half frozen, with ice forming overnight. I decided to wait it out one more night and leave early in the morning. That day, I kept the axe inside the cabin with me. I didn't go far from the porch. The woods stayed completely still, as if watching. I felt eyes on me even when there was nothing to see. Around noon, I heard a faint splash from the lake, like someone stepping into shallow water. When I went down to check, I saw more prints along the edge, leading toward the trees on the far side. Whoever it was, they were circling the area, keeping distance but not leaving. As evening fell, I packed most of my things, leaving only what I'd need for the night. I set the axe near the door and kept the fire going strong. I sat by the window for hours, listening. The wind came and went, and I began to think maybe it was over, that maybe whoever was wandering had moved on. But sometime after midnight, the dog in the distance started barking. There weren't many houses nearby, but I knew that bark was coming from somewhere down the road. It barked fast, loud, panicked, and then it just stopped. Minutes later, I heard that same slow crunch of footsteps in the leaves outside. Not running, not sneaking, just walking steady and deliberate. They moved around the cabin, circling it once, then again. The boards on the porch groaned under the weight. I stared at the door, gripping the axe handle so hard my hands hurt. The steps stopped just outside, maybe 2 feet from the door. I could hear faint breathing through the cracks. It stayed there for what felt like forever, then slowly walked away into the woods. I sat awake until dawn, not daring to move. When morning came, I stepped outside with the axe still in my hand. The ground was covered in frost and leaves, but near the porch, I saw them again. Bare footprints leading away, heading back toward the trees. They disappeared into the shadows beyond the clearing. I followed them a few steps before stopping. They led deeper into the forest, the prints getting fainter until they vanished entirely near the lake. I didn't bother cleaning up or finishing breakfast. I threw my things into the truck and started the engine. The tires spun in the mud before catching traction. As I pulled away, I saw the cabin in the rearview mirror, small, lonely, half hidden behind the trees. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near the highway, hours later. When I finally stepped out, my legs were shaking. I went inside, bought coffee, and just stood there for a while, staring out the window. The people around me were laughing, talking, moving normally. Felt strange, almost unreal, after the silence of that place. I never reported it to anyone. There was no proof, no reason for the police to drive all the way out there. I just told the rental owner that something had damaged the back latch and that I left early. He refunded me half without asking questions. Weeks later, I saw a local news article online about a missing man from a nearby county. He was described as mentally unstable, last seen wandering along the forest roads near the same area. The photo showed a tall, thin man, barefoot, wearing torn clothes, his eyes looking distant. They never found him. Sometimes I still think about those nights. The sound of footsteps, the breathing on the other side of the door, the prints leading into the woods. It wasn't a ghost or anything supernatural. It was just a person, and somehow that made it a lot worse. It had been raining all day when I reached the clearing where I planned to build the small cabin. The sky was heavy and dull, the kind of gray that feels like it's pressing down on your shoulders. The year was 2009, and I was 32 then, tired of city noise, bills, and the endless sound of car horns. I had bought a small piece of land deep in the woods of northern Oregon, about 2 miles from the nearest dirt road. I had no real plan except to build something with my own hands, even if it took me the whole year. The rain had started early that morning, a steady drizzle that soaked through the leaves and turned the soil into thick, sticky mud. My truck was parked half a mile down the path, stuck halfway in the ruts from the last rainfall. I carried what I could in a large duffel bag: some tools, nails, a tarp, and a few cans of food. My plan was to set up a small shelter first, then gather enough wood to start framing the cabin. It wasn't supposed to be much, just a single room space where I could live quietly, away from everything. The first few hours were all noise, the crack of branches under my boots, the soft thud of wet wood when I dropped it onto the muddy ground, and the endless patter of rain on my shoulders. The air smelled sharp, like pine and wet dirt. Everything around me dripped. The trees were dark and glossy, bending slightly with the weight of the water. There was no wind at first, just that heavy, constant rain that made the forest feel sealed off from the rest of the world. By late afternoon, the drizzle turned to a downpour. My jacket was soaked through. I had managed to set up a makeshift frame using some fallen logs and rope, but I still needed to fasten the tarp over it. Every time I lifted my hands to tie something, the rope slipped through my wet fingers. My breath came out white in the cold air. The forest had grown darker even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. The rain fell harder, bouncing off the tarp and splattering mud onto my boots. I could hear water rushing somewhere downhill. A stream, maybe, though I hadn't noticed it earlier. When I finally had the tarp secured, I crawled underneath it to get out of the rain. It was a small space, barely enough to sit upright, but it kept me dry for the first time that day. I opened a can of beans and ate in silence, listening to the storm. The sound of rain hitting plastic and leaves blended into one long, dull roar. Every now and then, thunder rolled far off, deep and lazy, like something heavy turning over in the sky. As it grew darker, the rain seemed to change its rhythm. It wasn't steady anymore. I began hearing breaks, pauses between the drops, like something moving between the trees. The forest had its own sounds, sure, but this was different. It wasn't the high chirp of birds or the rustle of small animals. It was slower, heavier. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was branches shifting under the weight of water. But then it came again, a distinct sound. Wet footsteps. I froze. The tarp flapped slightly in the wind, making a low snapping noise that mixed with the rain. I leaned forward and listened. Nothing but the steady hiss of water for a long minute. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The rain does that sometimes. It distorts sounds, makes them echo differently. Still, I felt the urge to grab something, anything, for protection. My hammer was lying beside my backpack, so I picked it up and held it tight. I waited for a long time before I started hearing it again. Footsteps, slow and dragging, moving closer from the direction of the stream. It didn't sound like an animal. It was too steady, too deliberate. I turned off my small battery lantern, letting the darkness close in completely. The only light came from brief flashes of lightning above the trees. For almost 10 minutes, I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing inside my ears. Then, through a thin tear in the tarp, I saw something, just the faintest outline of movement. Someone or something walking slowly across the clearing. The rain made it hard to see clearly. I squinted, trying to focus. It looked like a man, maybe 5 or 6 feet tall, hunched over slightly, moving unsteadily. The lightning flashed again, and I caught a glimpse of a coat, dark, soaked, clinging to the shape beneath it. Whoever it was didn't have a light, didn't say anything, didn't seem to even notice the tarp just a few yards away. They just walked right through the clearing and disappeared behind the trees again. I stayed under that tarp for what felt like hours. My legs went numb, my fingers were stiff, but I couldn't bring myself to move. When I finally crawled out, the rain had softened again. The forest was filled with the low gurgle of water running through the mud. I checked the ground where I had seen the figure pass. There were prints, long, uneven footprints that sank deep into the soft soil. The steps were spaced oddly, like whoever it was had been limping. I followed them for a short distance before they vanished into the grass near the stream. I didn't sleep that night. I sat under the tarp, hammer still in my hand, listening to every sound. I thought about packing up and leaving in the morning, but my truck was far, and the road was flooded. The only thing to do was wait until the rain eased. By morning, everything was damp and gray. My fingers were wrinkled from the moisture. The woods were quiet again, too quiet. I forced myself to work, cutting logs and clearing more space. Every time I turned my back, I felt the same prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. Around noon, I found something near the edge of the clearing. A small pile of broken branches arranged in a neat stack. They weren't there before. They looked freshly snapped, still wet inside, and each was about the same length. Someone had left them. The rest of that day went by slowly. The rain never fully stopped. My hands ached. My shoulders burned from lifting wood. But I kept working because doing something was better than sitting still and thinking. By evening, I had managed to raise half the cabin's frame. I nailed down boards until my arms trembled. When the light began to fade again, I built a small fire under the tarp. The smoke drifted up and mixed with the damp air. As darkness settled in, I noticed movement again. Not close this time, but deeper in the woods. Shapes, maybe trees swaying, maybe not. I tried not to look. I told myself it was just my nerves. Still, when I turned to grab my canteen, I realized something chilling. The hammer I had been using earlier was gone. I looked around, crawling through the mud, thinking I'd dropped it, but it wasn't there. That night, I didn't make a fire. I stayed inside the half-finished frame of the cabin, crouched beside my backpack with a small knife in my hand. I could hear faint rustling outside. Once, I thought I saw a shadow pass right in front of the entrance. No words, no sound, just movement. The rain covered everything else. By morning, the prints were back. This time, they circled the cabin. The same uneven steps, deep in the mud, as if someone had been walking around while I slept. My hammer lay a few feet away, driven halfway into the ground handle first, like it had been planted there. That was the moment I decided I couldn't stay. I packed up fast, barely caring that I left half my supplies behind. I walked through the rain without stopping, my boots sinking with each step, the cold biting through my soaked clothes. The forest felt alive behind me, full of quiet movement and dripping branches. When I reached my truck, the rain had turned into mist. My hands shook as I started the engine. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached the main road, where the trees finally thinned out and the sky looked open again. I pulled over and just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the mud on my boots. I never went back to that land. I sold it 6 months later, told the buyer it was too remote, too much work for one man. Maybe it was, or maybe it was something else. The feeling that someone had been there before me, still watching from those trees, waiting for anyone foolish enough to build where they didn't belong. Sometimes, even now, when it rains late at night, I think about that place. The sound of wet footsteps, the figure in the clearing, the hammer driven into the earth like a warning. And I know deep down that if I had stayed one more night, I might never have walked out of those woods again. It was the fall of 2008 when I decided to finally drive past my ex-husband's cabin. His name was Mark, and we had divorced 3 years prior after 10 years of marriage. I was 36 at the time, and for reasons I still couldn't fully explain, I felt this mix of curiosity and unease that pushed me to take that long, empty stretch of road leading up into the hills near Red Oak, a small town in northern Maine. The area was isolated, with tall pines on either side, their needles carpeting the narrow dirt road in thick, muffling layers. The wind was gusty that day, making the branches scrape against one another, producing an almost constant, low groan that seemed to follow me as I drove. I parked my old sedan at the edge of the property and took a moment to just stand there, breathing in the sharp, cold air. Mark's cabin wasn't visible from the road. The place was hidden deep within the trees, built into a slight slope with its back almost touching a small hill. It was an old structure, with wooden siding that had darkened from years of exposure, and a tin roof that had begun to rust in patches. I had been here countless times before, during the happier parts of our marriage, though by now it felt like stepping into a place frozen in memory. The air smelled faintly of damp pine and decaying leaves. As I walked up the narrow, winding path leading to the cabin, I noticed that the underbrush had grown thick. The last time I had been here, Mark had kept the area clear, chopping down fallen branches and raking leaves. Now the path was uneven, almost hidden in some areas, and the crunch of my boots on the fallen needles and sticks was the only sound aside from the wind. The front porch sagged slightly under the weight of time, and I had to step carefully over a warped board to reach the doorway. I hesitated, my hand resting on the cold, splintered wood of the railing. I wasn't entirely sure why I had come. Maybe a need for closure, maybe a lingering sense of unresolved fear. Mark had always been unpredictable, his temper subtle but explosive when provoked. Even now, years after our divorce, I could still feel that tension that had made living with him exhausting. Pushing the door open, I was hit by the smell of dust and mildew. The cabin had clearly been uninhabited for months, maybe even years. The interior was dim, sunlight filtering weakly through grimy windows. Everything felt still, too still. I moved slowly, stepping over broken boards and scattered debris. On the floor, I noticed a few tools, a rusted hatchet, and a coil of rope. Oddly, there was a stack of unopened mail in one corner, yellowed with age. Nothing seemed recently touched, yet something about the place made my stomach tighten. I walked to the living area, where a small stone fireplace dominated the wall. The stones were blackened with old soot, and the hearth was covered in a thin layer of ash. I found a chair pushed over near the fireplace, its legs splintered and one armrest cracked. It was unsettling to see the cabin frozen like this, as if whoever had left had done so in a hurry and never returned. I ran my fingers along the mantel, feeling a layer of dust so thick it puffed up with each touch. There was a photograph, faded and cracked at the edges. It showed Mark and me on a camping trip years ago. Seeing our younger faces, smiling, oblivious, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The real unease began when I noticed the floorboards. There was a subtle, uneven dip near the corner of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just warped wood, but when I leaned closer, I saw a dark stain that ran along the boards like a shadow. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. My mind ran through the possibilities. Spilled water, old paint, maybe even an oil leak from tools stored here. But the color and consistency unsettled me. It was thick, almost sticky. My stomach turned slightly, and I had to force myself to breathe steadily. I moved toward the back of the cabin, where the bedroom was tucked into a corner. The door was ajar, creaking ominously on its hinge as I pushed it open. The room smelled even worse than the rest of the cabin. Dampness mixed with something sour, metallic. The bed was stripped bare, the mattress sagging in the center. On the floor beside it, There were several items that clearly didn't belong. A few old cans of food, a broken lantern, and most disturbing, a small, crudely tied bundle of clothes that looked like it had been hastily thrown in a corner. I recoiled, my hand instinctively going to the pocket of my coat for my phone. Though there was no service out here, I tried to calm myself, telling myself this was just someone else using the cabin after Mark left, that it could be abandoned squatters or hunters who had left in a rush. But there was something about the silence, the total lack of recent human activity, that gnawed at me. I backed out of the room slowly, my eyes scanning the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Then I heard it, a faint scuffing sound from the back corner of the cabin. My heart jumped into my throat. It wasn't loud, not a crash or a bang, just a dragging, scraping noise. I froze, straining to hear over the thump of my pulse in my ears. I moved toward the sound carefully, stepping lightly over broken floorboards. When I reached the back wall, I saw a small trapdoor, partially hidden under an old rug. It hadn't been there, or at least I didn't remember it. The scraping had clearly come from below. I hesitated, debating whether to open it. My instincts screamed to leave, but something compelled me to see what was underneath. I gripped the handle, cold metal biting into my palm, and slowly lifted the door. The space below was narrow, a crude cellar with wooden steps descending into darkness. I shone my phone's flashlight down, revealing dirt-streaked walls and the faint outline of more tools and supplies. Then I saw it, a pair of boots, dusty and worn, standing at the bottom as if someone had stepped away just moments ago. I froze, my stomach knotting. There was no one visible beyond that. No voice, no movement, just the oppressive, silent dark. I took a step back, heart racing, and that's when I noticed the smell again. Stronger here. Metallic, sour, unmistakable. My breath caught. There had been an animal down there, or maybe more than one, long dead and decomposed. I realized that the cabin, Mark's cabin, had likely been a hiding place of some kind. Maybe for him, maybe for someone else after he left. I couldn't tell anymore, and the thought that I could be stepping into something dangerous made my hands shake. I didn't linger. I backed out, carefully closing the trapdoor, and moved quickly toward the door. The wind outside was even colder now, cutting through my jacket as I pushed the cabin door open. The light of late afternoon was fading fast, the shadows stretching long between the trees. I ran down the path, my boots crunching loudly over the pine needles, and didn't look back until I reached my car. Sitting inside, shivering, I tried to rationalize everything. The cabin had been abandoned, yes, but whatever had been down there, whatever had made that smell, that sound, it wasn't something I wanted to investigate further. I realized then that some parts of the past weren't meant to be revisited. You can drive past the place where someone used to live, you can see the walls they once touched, but there are layers of time and experience that can't be peeled back safely. I drove away slowly, eyes on the road, and as darkness fell over the pines, I felt a strange relief. I had faced the cabin, faced the memories, and I was leaving it all behind. When I got home later that evening, I showered, ate, and finally sat down with a blanket over my legs. I kept thinking about the trapdoor, the boots, the smell, but I also thought about the old photograph, the quiet, the abandoned place frozen in time. Life moved on, even if the places didn't. I realized then that closure wasn't about understanding everything. It was about surviving it, walking away, and letting the memory exist without letting it consume you. I never went back to that road, never drove past the cabin again. But sometimes, when the wind howls against the windows during a fall night, I still see the sagging porch, the rusted tin roof, the dip in the floorboards, and I remember the fear, the tension, and the strange, hollow relief of leaving it behind. It was late September when I decided to finally go back to my grandmother's old cabin. It had been sitting abandoned for years since she passed away, and nobody in the family wanted to deal with it. The cabin was deep in the woods outside a small town called Carter Hill, about 2 hours from where I lived. I was 31 then, and for some reason, that cabin had started showing up in my dreams. I would see its porch light flickering in the dark or hear the creaking of its floorboards. Maybe it was guilt, maybe nostalgia. Either way, I took a week off work, loaded up my truck, and drove out there with my dog, Rex. The road that led to the property was half gone. The gravel had been swallowed by weeds and roots, and the forest had crept in from both sides, making it feel like I was driving into a tunnel. It had rained the night before, so the air was heavy and smelled like wet soil. The trees were bending slightly under the weight of water, and the sound of dripping filled the silence. When I finally saw the cabin, it didn't look the way I remembered. The roof sagged in the middle, the porch railings leaned outward, and moss climbed up the wooden walls like green veins. I parked beside a tree stump and just sat there for a few minutes. The place felt off, not because it looked haunted or anything like that, but because it felt forgotten. No sound of insects, no birds, just wind pushing through the leaves. Rex growled softly when I opened the door, his ears standing up as he sniffed the air. I told myself it was just the smell of rot and damp wood that bothered him. The front door opened easily, which surprised me. Inside, the air was thick and stale. The smell hit first, a mix of mildew, old paper, and something faintly metallic. Dust floated through the light that came in from the cracked windows. I could see the old furniture still there, the same wooden table, the same rocking chair by the fireplace, even the old clock that never worked right. I set down my bags and walked through each room slowly. Everything was where it used to be except for one thing. The floor near the back door was warped, like something heavy had been sitting there for a long time. The boards bowed inward, darker than the rest. I stepped closer and noticed something strange. A faint smell, sharper than the rest of the cabin. It reminded me of rust and wet meat. I pushed the thought aside, figuring an animal had probably gotten trapped under the floor at some point. I spent the rest of the day cleaning. I opened the windows to let air in, swept the dust, and cleared a space for my sleeping bag. Rex wouldn't stop pacing, his claws clicking against the wood. When I tried to get him to settle near the fireplace, he refused. He just sat near the door, staring toward the warped section of the floor. That night, the wind picked up. The forest outside made that strange moaning sound it does when branches rub against each other. I tried to sleep, but the smell in the room kept bothering me. It was stronger now. At some point, I gave up trying to ignore it. I got my flashlight and pried up one of the boards near the warped spot. What I saw underneath didn't make sense at first. The beam of my flashlight showed something pale, something smooth and round. My first thought was that it was a rock, but then I saw the shape of a jaw, teeth still in place. It took me a full minute to process that it was a skull. I froze. My heartbeat was so loud I could hear it echoing in my ears. I moved the flashlight a little and saw more. Pieces of what looked like fabric, torn and dirty, and a hand, the fingers stiff and half buried in dirt. The smell hit full force then, sour and unmistakably human. I dropped the flashlight and stumbled back, almost tripping over Rex. I went outside, breathing hard. The air felt cold and clean compared to inside. I tried to calm myself down, pacing in front of the porch, telling myself it had to be something else. Maybe an old grave or an animal that died and got buried wrong. But deep down, I knew what I had seen. When I finally went back in, I couldn't stop staring at that hole in the floor. The flashlight was still shining on the edge of it, the light catching the outline of the skull. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat there, Rex pressed against my leg, both of us listening to every sound, every creak, every drip from the roof. In the morning, I made myself a cup of instant coffee on the old stove and tried to think clearly. I I needed to call the police, but there was no signal out there. I knew the nearest phone was about 6 miles away at a ranger station. I decided to leave right after breakfast. But before I did, something about that body kept pulling at me. It didn't look that old. The clothes weren't from my grandmother's time. They looked modern, like something from just a few years ago. I went back to the hole with a rag over my nose and started pulling up more boards carefully. There wasn't just one body. There were two. The second one was smaller, maybe a teenager or a young adult. Both of them had plastic tied around parts of their clothes, like someone tried to wrap them but gave up halfway. There were signs of rope, too, around the wrists. That's when I realized the boards above them weren't nailed evenly. Some had been replaced. Someone had hidden these bodies, and whoever did it had taken the time to make sure nobody would find them easily. I left the cabin immediately. Rex followed close behind, ears back, tail low. I locked the door even though it didn't matter and drove as fast as that broken road allowed. When I got to the ranger station, I told them what I found. The officer on duty didn't even question it. He just made a few calls and told me to wait. Later that day, a small team went out there. I followed them, staying back while they worked. I could see them through the trees, their gloves pulling up the same boards I had lifted. They were quiet the entire time. After a while, one of them walked outside and made a call. I remember his expression, calm, but with that tightness around the mouth that told me he'd seen something bad. It turned out the bodies belonged to two hikers who went missing around 5 years ago. They had last been seen near the same stretch of forest. Their car had been found miles away, doors unlocked, keys still inside. The police never figured out what happened to them. Until now, they questioned me for hours afterward, trying to piece together what I knew, but I didn't have anything to give. I hadn't been to that cabin since I was a teenager. My grandmother died long before those hikers disappeared. The only strange thing I could remember was that one of her old neighbors, a man named Alton, used to help her with repairs. He was quiet, always kept to himself. After she died, he stayed in the area for a while, cutting wood for people. Then he just vanished one winter. No one cared enough to look for him. When they checked old property records, they found out that Alton had been using the cabin's back shed for storage for years after my grandmother passed. They said it wasn't impossible that he'd brought those people there, maybe offering them a place to rest, maybe something worse. Whatever his reason, he was gone, and there was nothing left to trace. I sold the cabin not long after that. I couldn't keep it, not after what had been under those floors. Sometimes I still think about that smell, that sharp metallic stench that never really went away. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can picture the way the light from my flashlight hit the skull, the way the silence in that cabin pressed against me like a weight. I've never gone back to Carter Hill since. The road, the forest, the cabin, they're all still there, but as far as I'm concerned, that place stopped belonging to my family the moment I lifted those boards. What lay underneath had turned it into something else. Not haunted, not cursed, just heavy with the kind of truth nobody wants to find. And every now and then, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think about how close I was to sleeping right above them, not knowing what was beneath me. That thought alone is enough to keep the lights on until morning. It was late October 2014 when I decided to take a week off from work and drive up to a small cabin I'd rented in the woods of northern Montana. I'd found the listing online. Cheap, remote, quiet, and after months of nonstop city noise and long office hours, I just wanted peace. The cabin looked simple in the pictures, sitting a few miles away from the nearest paved road, surrounded by thick trees and an uneven gravel trail that wound up through the forest. The drive from Billings took almost 8 hours. The last hour was the hardest, the road narrowing into a single lane of dirt that twisted around sharp turns. My phone had lost service long before I reached the property. There were no houses, no signs, just trees that seemed to close in tighter the higher I went. The air grew colder as the sun began to sink, and I remember the smell of pine mixing with the damp scent of soil and old leaves. I had a dull headache from the long drive, and my hands were sore from gripping the steering wheel. When I finally reached the cabin, it was almost dusk. It looked older than in the pictures. Weathered boards, a sagging porch, and a small chimney with a rusted metal pipe. I parked next to it, got out, and stretched my legs. The forest was silent except for a faint rustle of wind moving through the trees. There was no sound of cars, no birds, nothing. Inside, the cabin was small but livable. There was a single bed pushed against the far wall, a narrow kitchen counter with a gas stove, a wooden table, and a fireplace built from gray stone. The place smelled faintly of old smoke and something musty, like damp wood that hadn't completely dried. I unpacked my things, set my flashlight on the table, and went outside to bring in some firewood stacked near the back wall. By the time I got a fire going, it was fully dark. I ate a can of soup, drank a beer, and sat near the window watching the firelight flicker across the glass. The night outside looked bottomless, blacker than I expected, the kind of darkness where you can't tell where the trees end and the sky begins. That first night, I slept lightly. The woods made unfamiliar noises, branches shifting, dry leaves scratching against the siding, and a constant tapping somewhere near the back of the cabin. I assumed it was the wind or maybe an animal, but at one point, I woke up to the sound of my dog growling low near the door. I hadn't brought a dog. The sound had come from outside, deep, steady, and close. I sat there listening, holding my breath, waiting for it to stop. It did after a while, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I stepped out early. The air was crisp and still, and the ground was covered with a thin layer of frost. I walked a few hundred feet into the woods to stretch my legs. The trees were tall and thin, spaced just far enough apart that you could see several yards in each direction. About 50 feet from the cabin, I noticed an old fence half buried in the ground, its posts rotting and uneven. Near it was a narrow path leading deeper into the trees. Curiosity got the better of me, so I followed the path. It wasn't long, maybe 100 yards, before I came across what looked like the remains of another cabin. The roof had collapsed, the walls caved in, and what was left was just a rectangle of broken boards and stones. Old metal tools lay scattered among the weeds, rusted beyond use. There was an overturned stove, a mattress spring half buried in dirt, and a pile of glass shards that might have once been a window. I crouched down to look closer and noticed a dark patch in the soil, almost black, like old fire damage or something spilled years ago. The wood nearby was charred too, though only in a small area. I didn't think much of it at the time. The place just looked like it had burned long ago. When I got back to my cabin, I realized something small but odd. My truck door was slightly open. I was certain I'd closed it earlier. I checked inside. Nothing seemed missing, though my backpack had been unzipped and one of the side pockets was open. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I hadn't closed it properly. Still, it left a strange feeling in my stomach. The rest of the day passed slowly. I read a bit, walked around, chopped some firewood, and tried to enjoy the quiet. But that quiet had started to feel heavy, like it was pressing in from all sides. By sunset, I was on edge again. I locked the door, kept the fire burning low, and tried to sleep early. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise that made my skin crawl. It wasn't wind or branches this time. It was footsteps, slow, steady, crunching across the frozen leaves outside. They stopped near the window. My heartbeat was so loud I could feel it in my throat. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was dim, just the faint orange glow of coals. I didn't move. I stared toward the window but couldn't see anything. Then came the faint creak of the porch boards. Someone or something was standing right outside the door. The footsteps shifted again, softer now, like whoever it was had stepped off into the dirt. After a long minute, the sound faded away. I waited for what felt like hours before I finally got up and checked the window. Nothing but darkness. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the door, gripping the heavy flashlight in my hand. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw it. Clear footprints in the frost leading from the tree line to my porch. They were boot prints, not animal tracks. The size looked close to my own. They stopped at the door and turned back into the woods. I felt sick. My first thought was that maybe a hiker or hunter had wandered near, but this deep into the forest, and that close to my cabin, there were no other trails or houses nearby. Whoever it was had come straight to my door. I decided to leave that day, but when I tried starting my truck, the engine sputtered and died. I popped the hood and found that the battery cable had been loosened. Not cut, just unscrewed enough that it wouldn't start. That was when panic hit hard. Someone had been close enough, long enough to do that. I tightened it back with a wrench from my toolkit, loaded my stuff as fast as I could, and left. But about a mile down the road, I saw something in my rearview mirror that made me grip the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. A man was standing in the middle of the dirt road behind me, half hidden by the trees. He didn't move, just stood there. I didn't stop. I drove until I reached the highway, only slowing down once I saw the sun high above the hills. Later that night, when I checked into a small roadside motel, I noticed something else. My backpack had been shifted around again. The zipper on the same pocket was open, and inside was a small metal key I'd never seen before. Old, heavy, with a tag on it that said L12. I never figured out what that key was for. I didn't go back to find out. A few months later, I looked up that cabin listing again out of curiosity. It was gone from the rental site. When I searched the property address, I found a brief local article from years back about a fire in 1996 that had destroyed a cabin in that same area. The article mentioned that a man had been living there illegally for months before it burned down. His name wasn't given, just a note saying authorities never found his remains. Only a few personal belongings left behind. A toolbox, a bed frame, and a set of labeled keys. The picture in the article showed one of those keys. The same kind that had been inside my bag. That was the last time I ever went anywhere that remote alone. Even now, sometimes when I drive through long, empty stretches of forest, I find myself checking the side mirror more than I should, half expecting to see someone standing there again, watching me disappear into the trees. It was the fall of 2014 when I decided to take a week off work and drive up north to a cabin my cousin had told me about. It wasn't some vacation rental or scenic tourist spot. It was an old place tucked in the woods near the edge of a small, half-forgotten town called Holbrook. The cabin belonged to some distant family friend who'd left it and used for years. My cousin said it was quiet, peaceful, and perfect for someone like me who wanted to get away from people for a while. I didn't think twice. I just packed my truck with food, a few changes of clothes, my dog Max, and a small toolbox in case the place needed fixing up. The drive took about 6 hours from where I lived in St. Paul, Minnesota. Most of it was through long stretches of forest roads, with patches of fog and mist curling between the trees. The air felt different there, colder, heavier somehow, even though it wasn't winter yet. By the time I reached the narrow gravel road that led to the cabin, it was already late afternoon. The trees stood so close to the sides of the road that their branches scraped the truck as I drove. The sound of gravel under the tires was the only thing I could hear. When I first saw the cabin, it looked smaller than I expected. It sat on a slight slope facing a half-dried creek bed. The paint had long peeled off, leaving the wood underneath gray and cracked. The porch leaned slightly to one side, and the windows were covered in a thick layer of grime. It didn't look welcoming, but it was solid enough to stay in. I parked the truck, got Max out, and walked around the place to check if it was safe. Inside, it smelled of old wood, dust, and something faintly metallic, like rust. The floorboards creaked with every step. There was a small wood stove in one corner, a table with a couple of chairs, and a single bed with an old wool blanket that smelled like mildew. I opened the windows to let some air in. The light that came through was dim and yellowish, filtered by the dirt on the glass. Max sniffed around and settled down near the door. That first night was calm. I cooked some canned soup on the stove, listened to the steady patter of rain starting outside, and watched the trees sway in the wind. The sound of rain on the metal roof had a rhythm to it that made me feel both uneasy and relaxed at the same time. The nearest neighbor, according to my cousin, was about 3 miles away. There was no cell service. It was complete isolation. By the second night, things started to feel off. I had been out chopping some firewood before the sun went down, and as I was stacking the pieces by the porch, I noticed footprints in the mud that weren't mine. They looked fresh, not too big, not too small, but definitely from boots. They led from the side of the cabin to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared among the leaves. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe someone from the town came up here at some point, or maybe they were old prints from before the rain. Still, they didn't look washed out or soft like old ones. They were sharp and deep. That night, I locked the door, something I hadn't bothered to do the night before. I tried to read a book I'd brought, but every time the wind pressed against the cabin walls or a branch hit the roof, my attention snapped up. Max would lift his head too, ears up, but then he'd settle again, as if deciding it wasn't worth worrying about. Around midnight, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't the wind or rain. It was a dull, slow thump. Came from somewhere outside, near the back of the cabin. My heart started to race, but I didn't move for a while. I just lay there, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to decide if I'd imagined it. Then it came again, that same thump, spaced out, deliberate. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and quietly moved to the small back window. The beam of light barely cut through the dark, but I could make out the faint outline of something leaning near the shed that stood behind the cabin. The shed's door was open, creaking slightly in the wind. I didn't see anyone, just the open space and the movement of wet leaves. After a few minutes of watching and not seeing anything move, I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went to check the shed. Inside, there were old tools scattered on the floor, a rusted saw, some empty cans, and a broken chair. But what caught my eye were the muddy footprints leading into it and not leading out. They stopped at the back wall, where the boards looked slightly different, like they'd been replaced more recently than the rest. The nails were newer, shinier. For a second, I just stared, trying to understand why someone would fix just one part of the wall. Pushed on it, but it didn't move. I didn't have the right tools to open it, so I told myself I'd check later and went about the day trying to distract myself with small repairs. Tightening window frames, clearing leaves from the porch roof, cleaning out the stovepipe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there before me, recently. That night, it rained again, heavier this time, loud enough to drown out most sounds. I fell asleep at some point, but around 3 a.m. Max started growling low, the kind of growl that comes from deep in his chest. I sat up immediately. His ears were pointed toward the door. The rain was still going hard, but underneath it, I thought I heard something. Faint, like slow footsteps on the porch. Not fast, not heavy, just pacing. Back and forth. I froze. Every sound felt magnified. My own breathing, Max's low growl, the faint creak of wood under weight. I waited for it to stop. Didn't. The pacing continued for what felt like forever. I didn't go near the door, didn't even move. Eventually, after maybe 10 minutes, it went silent. I stayed awake until the first light came through the window. When I finally stepped outside, there were muddy footprints again, this time on the porch. They led right up to the door and turned back toward the woods. My stomach dropped when I noticed they weren't the same as the ones from before. These were bare feet, human, barefoot, deep enough to show the shape of the toes. I stood there staring for a long time, trying to come up with any reason that made sense. Maybe a hunter, maybe some local drifter, maybe just someone passing through. But who walks barefoot through cold mud at 3 in the morning in the middle of nowhere? That was the day I decided to leave early. I packed most of my things before noon, but before I left, something in me needed to check that shed wall again. I went back with a hammer and pried at the boards where the newer nails were. After pulling off 3 of them, a smell hit me, thick, sour, and unmistakable. I stopped. Inside the gap behind the boards, something was there. A bundle of old plastic tarp, stained dark, with what looked like clothing tangled in it. I didn't need to open it to know what it was. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the hammer. I backed away and ran to the truck, calling Max to follow. I didn't look back once. The drive back down that narrow gravel road felt endless. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone standing there watching. When I got into Holbrook, I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them what I'd found. They sent people up that afternoon. I didn't stay to see what they pulled out, but later, after a few days, I saw the report online. They'd found human remains, several wrapped and hidden behind that wall. They said it must have been there for years. No one ever got caught for it. The cabin was condemned, and the property was closed off permanently. It's been years since that trip, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of rain and think about those bare footprints on the porch, the sound of pacing, the shed. And I wonder if whoever left those prints that night was the same person who put those bodies there, or someone still looking for them. It was the middle of October, 2016, when I decided to take a few days off work and drive up north to a small cabin near the edge of a forest in Montana. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a one-room place my uncle had built years ago. I hadn't been there since I was a teenager, and back then it was just a hunting spot for him and a few friends. I wanted some quiet for once, a place away from my phone, traffic, and people. I took my dog, a brown shepherd mix named Riley, because he was good company and he hated being left behind. The drive took me nearly 6 hours from Billings. By the time I reached the narrow gravel road leading up to the cabin, the sun had started to drop behind the tree line. The light was thin, and the air felt colder as I climbed higher into the hills. The last few miles were rough, uneven dirt, deep ruts, and rocks that made the truck rattle. The forest on both sides was so dense it felt like it was swallowing the road. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the light had already started to fade into a gray-blue dusk. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered. The wood was darker now, the roof sagged a little in the middle, and some of the windows had warped with age. But it was still standing, and that was all I needed. I parked close by, got out, stretched my legs, and let Riley run around to sniff the place. The air smelled like wet pine and dirt, that heavy forest smell that sticks to your clothes. Inside, the cabin was cold and still. Dust coated the wooden counter, the shelves, the window frames. There was one old oil lamp hanging from a hook, and the faint smell of stale smoke lingered, probably from the old stove in the corner. I swept the floor with a broom that was still leaning against the wall, cleared off a table, and got the small fireplace going. The dry wood I'd brought from home caught quickly, filling the place with a flickering orange light and a little bit of warmth. I made some instant noodles, fed Riley, and then sat by the fire with a book. For a while, everything was fine. It was quiet, the kind of silence you only get far away from cities. Every sound carried. The occasional crack from the fire, the the soft rustle of the trees outside, the faint sound of wind sliding through branches. But that silence also made small noises seem bigger, and after an hour or so I started noticing things I hadn't before. The thump of something shifting on the porch or the quick patter of movement outside. Riley would lift his head and stare at the door, ears perked, but then lie back down again when nothing followed. I told myself it was just raccoons or squirrels. Out here, that was normal. Later that night, I went outside to relieve myself. I had a flashlight in one hand and Riley followed me, sticking close to my leg. The air had gone sharp and cold. I could see my breath fog up in the beam of the light. I remember the silence most of all, the kind that almost presses against your ears. I could hear the faint hum of insects, the whisper of leaves, and then something else. It was faint, far off at first, like something scraping wood, a dragging kind of sound. I stopped moving, holding my breath. Riley froze, his body tense, ears pointing straight ahead toward the trees behind the cabin. Then the sound stopped. I waited a few seconds, scanning the dark line of trees with my flashlight. The beam caught nothing but trunks and undergrowth. The forest just stared back, unmoving. I went back inside, shut the door tight, and made sure to wedge a piece of wood across it just in case. Riley wouldn't settle for a while. He kept pacing near the door, occasionally growling under his breath. When he finally lay down beside me, I left the light on and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime around 3 in the morning. The fire had died down to glowing coals, and the cabin was cold again. Riley wasn't beside me anymore. I sat up, feeling that sudden jolt of unease when something isn't right. The flashlight was on the table, so I grabbed it and looked around. Riley was standing near the window, staring out, his tail stiff, body low. His breath fogged the glass as he looked toward the tree line. I didn't hear anything at first, but then, faintly, came that same dragging sound again. Slow, like something being pulled through dirt. I stayed still for almost a full minute, just listening. It wasn't constant, it would stop, then start again. It sounded maybe 30 or 40 feet away, behind the cabin. I didn't want to go out there. Every instinct told me to stay put, but I also didn't want whatever it was, bear, coyote, person, getting into the trash or scratching up the side of the place. I pulled on my jacket, grabbed the flashlight and the small hatchet I kept by the fire, and slowly opened the door. The cold hit me hard. The air outside felt heavier, like it was full of mist. My flashlight beam cut through it, catching the damp shimmer of leaves and wood. Riley followed right behind me, silent, his nose working. I stepped around the side of the cabin, sweeping the light across the ground. The sound had stopped again. The dirt was uneven and wet from the rain earlier in the evening, and near the back corner of the cabin, I saw something strange. A deep, narrow drag mark, cutting through the mud and leading off into the trees. It was fresh. The edges were sharp, not softened by weather or time. It looked like someone had dragged a heavy bag or a tarp through there, maybe even something larger. My first thought was an animal kill, a deer or elk that someone had shot and was hauling back. But there were no boot prints, no tire tracks, just the drag line disappearing into the darkness. I followed it a few steps before stopping. The forest ahead was pitch black. The longer I stood there, the more wrong it felt. Riley started growling, low and steady, staring into the dark where the trail led. That was enough for me. I turned back toward the cabin, locked everything again, and sat with my back against the wall until daylight. When morning came, the forest looked completely normal again. Quiet, calm, almost beautiful. The drag marks were still there, though clearer now in the daylight. I followed them a little further this time, maybe 50 yards into the trees. They ended abruptly at a patch of disturbed soil, like someone had dug and covered something in a hurry. The dirt looked newer than the ground around it, and the smell, it was faint but sour, like rot just starting. My stomach turned. I didn't touch it, didn't dig, didn't want to know. I packed up right after that, threw everything back in the truck, doused the fire, and took one last look at the cabin. I planned to stay 3 nights. I lasted one. As I drove back down the gravel road, Riley lay quietly in the seat beside me, eyes fixed on the window like he was watching something move behind us. I didn't tell anyone about what I found for a long time. When I finally did mention it to my uncle a year later, he just frowned and said hunters sometimes dump carcasses out there, which I guess made sense. Still, it didn't explain why the soil looked so freshly turned, or why Riley had been so tense for hours afterward, or why I kept thinking about that dragging sound in the middle of the night. A few months ago, out of curiosity, I looked up that area online. There was a small news piece about a missing man from 2016, a drifter who'd last been seen near that same forest road. They said he was never found, just his truck abandoned a few miles north of where the cabin sits. I don't know if that patch of disturbed dirt was connected or not. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it really was just an animal. But I still remember that smell, that cold air, and the sound of something heavy being pulled through the mud. I haven't been back to that cabin since. I don't think I ever will. I didn't plan to end up in a place like that, not on that October evening in 1987. I had been driving for hours along the narrow back roads of northern Maine, the sort of roads that twisted through dense pines and birch trees that seemed to press close to the car. My old pickup rattled and groaned, the headlights barely cutting through the creeping fog that had rolled in off the marshes. I wasn't really lost. I thought I knew roughly where I was. But the map I had was old and nearly illegible, and cell phones didn't exist for people like me back then. I was 24, broke, and used to sleeping in my truck when work ran late, which it often did. But that night, I had been hoping to find a place, any place, to just rest my head for a few hours before the morning hunt. I spotted the cabin long before I realized it was there. It sat on a slight rise, just beyond the edge of an old graveyard I hadn't noticed on the map. The cemetery was small, maybe 20 or 30 graves. Most of the stones weathered into shapes I could barely read. Moss covered the markers, and some had toppled completely, lying face down in the wet leaves. I felt a strange pull toward the place, a mixture of curiosity and exhaustion, and I guess I was desperate enough not to care about the unease settling over me. The cabin itself was modest, maybe 20 by 20 feet, built from rough-hewn logs with a sagging roof that looked like it had been patched more times than it had been built. The door hung crooked, and a single window stared blankly into the dark like an empty eye. I parked the truck near the edge of the clearing and walked up. The air was damp, the smell of decaying leaves and earth thick in my nose. I pushed the door, and it groaned, the hinges protesting loudly in the quiet night. Inside, it smelled of wet wood and dust. There was a small stove in the corner, a metal bed frame with no mattress, and a table with a few broken chairs. I dropped my pack and sat on one of them, rubbing my hands together to stay warm. Outside, the wind rattled the loose boards, and the sound of branches scraping against the walls made my stomach tighten. After a while, I crawled into the bed frame, using my jacket for a pillow, and tried to sleep. But the more I tried, the more I heard. At first, it was faint, rustling in the brush, the groan of trees, but then I noticed footsteps, slow, deliberate steps around the cabin. I sat up, straining to see in the darkness. There was no one visible, but the footsteps moved in a pattern, circling, stopping, and circling again. My heart pounded. I considered calling out, but it didn't feel right. If someone was really out there, they weren't expecting company. I got up and grabbed the flashlight from my pack, sweeping the beam over the outside. The clearing was empty, but the graveyard looked different under the light. Shadows stretched from the gravestones like long, dark fingers. I shook off the feeling creeping over me and told myself it was just my imagination. The wind, maybe a stray animal. Nothing human, nothing dangerous. Then I noticed something odd. A fresh set of footprints led from the cabin toward the graves. They weren't mine. They were heavier, wider, and sunk slightly deeper into the wet soil, like the person or animal was carrying weight. I swallowed hard and tried to convince myself to ignore it, to just stay put until morning. But curiosity, stupid as it was, made me follow. The footprints led past stones that were centuries old. Some had barely any inscriptions left, just a name and a date that I couldn't read. The newest graves were small, unkempt, and recent. It occurred to me then that someone had been here not long ago. Someone had been wandering the cemetery in the dark, not making a sound, not leaving any clue beyond the prints. My stomach tightened further. I stepped carefully among the graves, trying not to make noise. The flashlight illuminated wet leaves and mud, the occasional stone with strange etchings I didn't recognize. That's when I saw it. A patch of disturbed earth near the edge of the cemetery. A shallow hole, barely covered with loose dirt. I felt my hands go cold. Whoever had been here had been digging. I turned back toward the cabin, deciding I had no business standing there. That's when I noticed a figure at the tree lean, just beyond the cemetery. I couldn't see features clearly, just the outline of someone standing perfectly still, watching. My breath caught. I considered running, but my legs felt frozen. After what felt like an eternity, the figure moved, disappearing among the trees. Back in the cabin, I tried to settle down again, but sleep wouldn't come. I stayed awake, listening. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the pines, the wind had died, and the forest was eerily silent. I finally dared to step outside, my eyes scanning the graveyard. The shallow hole I had seen was gone. Someone had covered it. Fresh dirt packed down neatly. Whoever had been out there was meticulous. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I loaded my pack into the truck and started the engine, the metal groan echoing through the trees. I drove slowly, constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following me. But the road was empty. The graveyard, the cabin, the quiet forest receded behind me like a bad dream I couldn't shake. By the time I reached a small town an hour later, I was still shaking, though I tried to act normal. I stopped at a diner for coffee, hands wrapped tightly around the cup. I couldn't get the image out of my head. The figure watching from the tree lean, the footprints, the freshly dug hole. I realized then that I had witnessed something, maybe nothing criminal, maybe something dangerous, but it didn't matter. The forest and that cabin had secrets I wasn't meant to understand. Later that week, I read in the local paper about an old man who lived alone near that same stretch of forest. He had been arrested for digging graves, though authorities couldn't explain why. Some thought he was looking for relics. Others speculated about stolen items buried with the deceased. I didn't need to read further. I knew that cabin, that graveyard. It was part of a quiet, hidden world where curiosity could get you noticed and the forest kept its own rules. Years later, I drive through that area less often. When I do, I avoid the back roads entirely. But sometimes, late at night, I remember the cold air, the smell of damp earth and pine, the footprints in the mud, and the feeling of being watched. I remember the shallow hole and the way the forest seemed to breathe around that cabin. And I realize how lucky I was to leave when I did. No ghosts, no fairitales. Just an old cabin, a forgotten cemetery, and a person who moved silently among graves. That was enough to make the night one I'll never forget. It was the fall of 1998 when I first drove up to the cabin. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the crisp smell of damp leaves and pine sap. I had taken the old Ford up the winding dirt road that led into the hills of northern Montana, the kind of road that seemed to have been forgotten by time, lined with trees so close together that sunlight barely touched the ground. I was 26, alone, and had been hunting these mountains since I was a teenager. This cabin had belonged to my uncle, a man who had lived off the grid for years before his passing the previous spring. The place was supposed to be mine now, and I wanted it mostly for the hunting and the quiet, the chance to get away from the city for a few weeks. The first thing I noticed when I arrived was how much the forest had crept in. The cabin itself was small, made of rough logs and a sloping tin roof, with a chimney that leaned slightly to one side. The windows were thick with dust and grime, and the door creaked on its hinges. I had to push hard to get it open, and when I stepped inside, the smell of mildew hit me instantly. It was damp and earthy, like the cabin had been holding its breath all winter. Inside, there was a wood stove in the corner, rusted but intact, a small table, and a couple of rickety chairs. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I could see patches of dark mold along the walls and in the corners near the ceiling. I set down my pack, which was heavy with supplies: extra blankets, canned food, a hunting rifle, and some old ammunition that I wasn't sure I trusted. I had come prepared, but the place still made me uneasy. Not a kind of fear that was immediate or shocking, but the slow, creeping kind that made your skin feel tight. I spent the first day cleaning up, pulling out old spider webs, and trying to make the cabin livable. The forest outside was alive with sounds: the cawing of crows, the rustle of branches, and the distant call of elk. I could feel the wind moving through the gaps in the logs, a cold draft that seemed to follow me wherever I went inside. I stacked some firewood near the stove and managed to get a small fire going, the first real warmth I had felt since leaving the car. That night, I slept poorly on the old cot in the corner, listening to the wind press against the roof like it wanted in, and the sounds of animals moving around outside. The next morning, I decided to check my hunting gear. I strapped on my pack and made my way down the trail that led into a clearing I remembered from years ago. The forest here was dense, the kind that makes you feel like the trees themselves are watching. I was looking for deer, maybe elk, but I kept my senses sharp, moving quietly, listening. By mid-morning, I spotted fresh tracks, large, hoofed, leading deeper into the woods. I followed them carefully, taking slow steps, scanning the underbrush. By the time the sun was high, I realized I had gone farther than I intended. The tracks seemed to vanish near a small creek, and I stopped to drink and rest. That's when I noticed something else: footprints that didn't belong. Smaller but human. Someone had been here recently. My stomach tightened. I hadn't seen another person all morning, but the prints were clear, pressed into the soft soil near the creek. I scanned the trees and the hills. Nothing, just the wind and the rustle of leaves. I decided to head back. The forest, which had seemed beautiful and calming in the early morning, now felt ominous. The shadows were longer, darker, almost alive. Every snap of a twig under my boots made my heart jump. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was low, and the wind had picked up. I closed the door carefully, bolted it, and checked the windows. Everything seemed normal, but then I noticed it: a fresh set of footprints in the mud outside the back door. They weren't mine. They weren't my uncle's either. That night, sleep was impossible. I kept the rifle close, loaded and ready. The wind rattled the tin roof and whistled through the cracks in the walls. I could hear animals outside, but there were other sounds too: footsteps, soft at first, then heavier, moving around the perimeter. I tried to tell myself it was the wind or a deer, but the prints outside couldn't be explained that way. I sat by the fire until dawn, rifle in hand, heart pounding. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay inside. I spent hours checking traps I had set days before, walking the forest edges, making sure I wasn't being stalked. The strange prints were everywhere now, leading to and from the cabin, but never showing anyone. I thought about calling for help, but there was no signal, and even if there was, who would believe someone was walking around the hills without being seen? I started to understand what it felt like to be truly alone, and watched. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. At night, sounds circled the cabin. During the day, the prints appeared and disappeared, never revealing the person. It wasn't supernatural, not in the sense of a ghost or a fairy tale creature. It was someone or something that knew how to move quietly, how to stay hidden, how to unsettle without being seen. The fear it created was real enough. I began checking my rifle every hour, making makeshift barricades with furniture, and keeping a fire burning at all times. It wasn't until the fourth day that I saw it clearly. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in dirty, layered clothes that blended perfectly with the forest. He didn't run, didn't call out, just stood across the clearing and watched me for a long time before disappearing into the trees. I realized then that this wasn't a random trespasser. He had been living here or around here for who knew how long. The prints, the sounds at night, the way he could vanish at a moment's notice, it all made sense. And it made me more cautious than ever. I decided I had to leave. Not tomorrow, not in a few hours, but right then. I packed what I could, leaving behind the rest, and slipped quietly down the trail. The man didn't appear again, but I moved fast, never stopping to rest until I reached the dirt road. My truck was just as I had left it, though I checked the back seat twice before climbing in. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back until I was out of the hills entirely. When I finally reached the nearest town, hours later, I pulled into a gas station and shook as I filled the tank. I realized that what had kept me alive wasn't skill or luck. It was vigilance. The forest had its own kind of predator, one that didn't need ghosts or monsters to instill fear. It was real, human, and entirely capable of hiding in plain sight. I never went back to the cabin after that. My uncle's belongings were eventually cleared out, and the cabin fell further into disrepair. But every autumn, when the wind shifts and the smell of wet leaves and pine sap fills the air, I remember those 4 days. I remember the way the forest seemed alive in a different sense, how every shadow felt intentional, how even the quiet could hurt. And I remember the tracks, how someone could move silently around a place you thought was your own, and how quickly fear can make the familiar feel like a trap. I tell people it was just a hunting trip gone wrong, that I got spooked in the woods, and that's partly true. But I also know that the forest has its own residents, and some of them don't need to be seen to be dangerous. And the thought of that man, living unnoticed, watching and waiting, still keeps me awake on long drives through the hills. There's a clarity in that memory now, a lesson about boundaries, respect, and the fact that sometimes being alone isn't freedom, it's exposure. I have my own cabin now, much closer to the road, in a place where I can see for miles in every direction. I still hunt, still enjoy the peace, but I never forget what happened back then. And I never, ever take the forest for granted again. I had been a park ranger for nearly 6 years by the time I was assigned to the backcountry cabin in the northern stretch of the Sawtooth National Forest. It was the summer of 2012, and I was 28, fresh out of another spring season working the main ranger station near Red Pine. This assignment was supposed to be simple: monitor wildlife activity, check for illegal hunting, and maintain the cabin that sat deep in a narrow valley surrounded by thick evergreens. The drive up the dirt Forest Service road was rough. My truck groaned over potholes and loose gravel, tires slipping slightly on steeper inclines. By late afternoon, I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood. It looked like it had been built in the 1970s, maybe earlier. The wood was weathered and gray, but solid. A thin column of smoke from the small chimney suggested that whoever had been here last, probably a ranger rotating out before me, had left firewood stacked neatly near the door. I parked and stepped out. The air was crisp for summer, carrying the sharp scent of pine and moss. The surrounding trees were so tall and thick that light barely touched the forest floor. I felt a strange, heavy quiet. It wasn't eerie in a supernatural sense. It was just the kind of quiet that pressed in when humans weren't around. My boots crunched the dry pine needles as I approached the cabin, checking the small windows for damage and the door for signs of forced entry. Everything seemed in order. The cabin's interior was simple. A small living area with a wood stove, a table, a single bunk bed, and shelves with various supplies, canned food, a first aid kit, and old maps. There was a water jug in the corner and a small solar panel on the roof for emergency power. I set my backpack down and pulled out my notebook to log the start of my rotation. I was supposed to be here for 10 days entirely alone. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a small dinner over the stove, listened to the occasional distant call of an owl, and settled into the top bunk with my flashlight beside me. Sleep was uneasy, though. Every snap of a branch outside or rustle of leaves made me tense, but I chalked it up to being alone in the wilderness. By the second day, I had a routine. Morning patrols, checking trails for signs of poachers or injured wildlife. Midday, I'd rest in the cabin, log my observations, and prep for evening patrols. I noticed the wildlife activity was strange. Tracks of deer and small mammals, yes, but some tracks seemed too large and irregular, not matching any known animal I'd seen before. I assumed they were bears, though the size and spacing made me uneasy. On the third day, while walking a trail near a creek, I heard it. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across rocks. It stopped the moment I froze, and when I moved to investigate, I saw nothing. The forest was calm again, almost too calm. My heart raced, but I told myself it was probably a fallen tree or some natural noise. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening to the cabin creak and the wind through the pines. At around 1:30 a.m., I heard the faint sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My hand rested on the old rifle mounted above the stove. I pressed my ear to the window and strained to hear. The footsteps stopped near the door, and then I heard a soft, metallic scraping, like a knife or a crowbar brushing the wood. I didn't panic, not immediately. I had been trained for field emergencies, and breaking into a ranger cabin was not unheard of, even in remote areas. I crept to the door, checking the lock. It was secure. Whoever was outside couldn't get in without heavy force, and I doubted they had that kind of equipment with them. I decided to stay quiet, keep the lights off, and wait. Eventually, the sounds faded, and I dozed fitfully, waking every few minutes to check. The next day, I walked the perimeter and noticed subtle signs of intrusion. A few footprints in the soft dirt, marks on the cabin's siding, and oddly, a trail leading deeper into the forest that didn't match any known ranger path. The footprints were human-sized but messy, barefoot or in soft shoes, leaving elongated impressions. The idea that someone could be lurking nearby, hiding in the thick forest, gnawed at me. I stayed closer to the cabin for the remainder of the day, marking locations of the tracks and taking photographs with my camera. The real scare came on the 6th day. I was sitting at the cabin table, reviewing my notes and trying to finish a patrol log, when I noticed a shadow move across the window. I froze. The shadow was large and hunched, moving slowly across the cabin's perimeter. My pulse quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it at the window, but nothing was there. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the tree-line, but the forest was empty. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I spent hours walking the immediate area, checking behind trees, listening for the smallest sound. The sun dipped low, and the forest deepened into shadows. I returned to the cabin, locking the door, and sat silently, gun on my lap. That night, I didn't sleep at all. Every rustle, every snapping twig sounded deliberate. I kept the stove fire alive for warmth and as a sense of security, though it barely helped. By the 8th day, I was certain someone had been watching me, maybe even following me along the trails. The tracks I had found earlier led back to the cabin, never fully disappearing into the wilderness. I considered leaving, but my rotation required me to stay until relief arrived. I knew the forest well, and I also knew that the isolation was part of the job. The anxiety was heavy, but I kept meticulous notes and stayed alert. Finally, on the 10th day, I heard the unmistakable sound of a truck engine on the distant service road. Relief. I grabbed my radio and called in, announcing my location. Within the hour, my replacement arrived, and we drove back together down the rough road. As we left, I scanned the treeline one last time. I never saw anyone, never found the tracks again, and never discovered who had been outside the cabin that first night or why they had been there. I reported everything in my final log, detailing the footprints, the sounds, and the shadows. The Park Service marked the area for further monitoring, but no one ever identified an intruder. Looking back, I realized it had been a combination of isolation, unfamiliar noises, and someone using the forest as cover. It wasn't supernatural, it was human. The forest can hide people very well, and being alone made every small sound magnified, every shadow a potential threat. The experience left me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings in the backcountry. I returned to Red Pine Station and later moved to another ranger post farther south. But I never forgot that small, gray cabin in the northern valley of the Sawtooth. It taught me that the scariest things in the wilderness aren't ghosts. They're just other humans, capable of being silent, hidden, and dangerous, even when the forest seems completely empty. Even years later, whenever I hike in remote areas, I keep my senses sharp, remembering the nights I spent alone, listening to footsteps that may have belonged to a stranger lurking just beyond the treeline, and the uneasy knowledge that solitude in the wilderness can make ordinary dangers feel terrifying. But I also learned to trust my training, trust my instincts, and remain vigilant, because awareness is the difference between being caught off guard and making it through intact. I had been driving for hours through the Montana backroads, the kind that wind through stretches of pine forests and open plains where no one seems to live for miles. It was 1987, and I was 29, seeking a weekend away from the noise of city life in Denver. The plan was simple: find a cabin to rent, spend a few days alone, fish a little, read, maybe just walk in the woods and enjoy being utterly alone. I'd heard about an old cabin in the northern foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains. No one seemed to know who owned it now, but it had been standing for decades, tucked in a clearing that appeared on only the oldest maps. I reached the trailhead late in the afternoon. The sun was low, orange light pouring over the jagged peaks. My pickup rumbled along a dirt path that quickly narrowed into a rutted, overgrown track. Branches scraped the sides, leaves clinging stubbornly to the frame. Somewhere far off, a crow cawed, and the sound seemed too loud in the still air. I parked near a fallen log that marked the end of the drivable path. The last stretch, a few hundred yards of uneven ground, would have to be walked. The cabin emerged slowly through the trees, squat and gray, almost blending into the landscape. Its roof sagged, shingles missing, corners worn by decades of wind, snow, and rain. I stepped closer, boots crunching on dry pine needles, and felt my chest tighten. There was no smoke rising from a chimney, no sign of life, just the faint smell of wet wood and moss. The door hung slightly off its hinges, creaking with the wind. Inside, the air was stale, damp with the scent of old wood and rot. Sunlight pierced through gaps in the walls, illuminating thick dust motes dancing like tiny specks of gold. The floorboards groaned under my weight. I moved cautiously, careful not to step on anything that might break. The furniture, a couple of broken chairs and a table covered in dirt, looked like it hadn't been touched for years. I opened a window and the hinges screamed in protest. Outside, the forest was quiet, as if it were holding its breath. I set my pack down and began exploring. The kitchen area was little more than a corner with a rusted stove. Pots and pans lay in a heap, corroded, their lids missing. Drawers had been pulled open long ago, contents long gone. I glanced around the living space and noticed a faint line of footprints in the dust near the fireplace. They were small, maybe a child's, but some were larger, heavier. Someone had been here recently. A chill ran down my spine, but I told myself it was probably a hiker or a hunter. Nothing unusual. Upstairs, there was a small loft, accessible by a narrow ladder nailed to the wall. Each step creaked ominously. In the loft, old bedding lay matted and yellowed, the mattress flattened. I touched it, and a puff of dust made me cough. Against the far wall, a trunk sat covered in grime. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside were clothes, tattered but surprisingly intact, a pair of boots caked in mud, and some yellowed newspapers dating back decades. Among them, one sheet caught my eye, a crude sketch of the cabin's interior, with annotations about how to fortify the windows and doors. Someone had lived here carefully, maybe hiding, maybe preparing for something. The sun dropped lower, and shadows began to stretch through the cabin like dark fingers. I felt the first real unease creeping in. I decided to make a fire before nightfall. The fireplace was blackened with old soot. I gathered fallen branches from outside, smaller twigs, and some dry pine needles. Striking a match, the flame flickered, then caught. Soon, the fire was alive, throwing dancing shadows across the walls. The warmth was comforting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept looking at the windows, scanning the darkening forest. As night fell completely, the sounds of the forest became sharper. A branch snapped in the distance. Somewhere, maybe 100 yards off, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on dead leaves. I told myself it was an animal. Still, I double-checked the windows and the door, shoving the door as firmly as I could into its frame. My mind ran through worst-case scenarios, and I realized that this cabin, as old and abandoned as it looked, could easily be a hideout, a place where someone could sit quietly and watch. I tried to calm myself, sitting close to the fire. The wind outside howled through the broken roof, rattling the walls. Occasionally, something heavy would hit the outer wall, a falling branch probably. But in the dark, with the noises echoing, everything seemed amplified. I thought about sleeping upstairs, but the ladder looked unstable. Instead, I spread a blanket on the floor near the fire. I left the fire going, throwing a few logs on top to keep the flames high. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sound that froze me. It was soft, deliberate, the scratching of nails against wood. Not from outside, from inside. My heart pounded. I grabbed the nearest piece of wood, a splintered chair leg, and held it in front of me. The scratching stopped. I listened. The silence was deafening. Then, slow, dragging footsteps crossed the floor above me. Someone or something was upstairs. My mind raced, imagining a squatter who had been hiding, watching me all along. I had to think fast. I remembered the trunk with the newspapers and clothes. If someone was hiding here, they wouldn't expect me to use the back exit, the broken window in the kitchen. Quietly, I edged toward it, careful not to step on any loose boards that would betray my movement. I lifted the sash slowly and felt the cold air rush in. The forest outside was black, but I could see the shape of trees and rocks. I slipped through the window and crouched low in the brush. My lungs burned as I ran toward the trailhead, branches whipping my face. Every step felt loud in the heavy silence. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the pickup. I jumped in, fumbling with the keys. The engine roared to life. I didn't stop until the cabin was a distant shadow behind me, swallowed by the forest. When I finally reached the nearest small town, exhausted and shaking, I realized the cabin had been abandoned in the official records for decades, but someone had been living there, quietly, unseen, for years. The thought that someone could still be lurking in a place that seemed deserted was unsettling. I reported what I found to the local sheriff. They investigated later and found evidence of a makeshift living area, recent footprints, and signs that someone had been tracking the comings and goings in the area. The authorities speculated it had been a transient or a drifter, surviving in the remote woods, moving quietly, and avoiding contact with the outside world. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I avoided the mountains for a while. The memory of those dragging footsteps, the smell of moldy wood, the feeling of being watched, stayed with me. But life moved on. I came to respect the wilderness in a new way, its beauty, yes, but also its quiet danger. And I never returned to that cabin. The thing about that night, the lesson I carried with me, was that not all scary places are haunted. Some are just dangerous because people can vanish into them, unseen, unnoticed, living quietly at the edges of civilization. And when you stumble into one of those places by accident, it can be more terrifying than any ghost story. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a short trip up to the Peak District in England. I had been working non-stop in Manchester, and I wanted a weekend away from the city noise. I rented a small cabin that sat near the edge of a forest, about 15 miles from the nearest town. The listing described it as a simple off-grid retreat, which sounded exactly like what I needed. No Wi-Fi, no people, just quiet. The drive took nearly 4 hours. The roads got narrower the farther I went, and by the time I reached the turnoff for the cabin, the sun had already started to sink behind the hills. The path leading to the cabin was rough and covered with wet leaves. I parked a few yards away because I didn't want to risk getting my car stuck in the mud. From there, I walked the rest of the way, carrying my backpack and a small duffel bag. The air was cold and smelled faintly of rain and pine. The cabin was small, built from dark wood that looked weathered but sturdy. It had one front window, a tiny porch, and a metal chimney that still had a faint trace of smoke smell around it. Inside, it was plain but cozy. One room with a small bed, a wood stove, a table, and a sink that ran off a water tank. The owner had left a few logs near the stove and a note reminding guests to fill the tank outside if it ran dry. That first night was calm. I cooked some canned food, poured myself a drink, and sat on the porch as the last light disappeared. It was quiet in a way that city life never was. The only sounds were the wind pushing through the trees and the faint creaks of the wood cabin settling. I turned in early and slept surprisingly well. The next day, I hiked around the area. The forest stretched for miles, dense oak and birch trees with patches of moss covering everything. I found an old stone wall halfway through the woods, probably part of some long-abandoned property. The air was damp and cold, but I enjoyed it. By the time I returned, it was almost dusk again. I made a small fire in the stove, had some tea, and sat reading for a while before going to bed. It was that second night when things started to feel different. I woke up sometime after midnight. The fire had gone out, and the cabin was completely dark except for a bit of moonlight leaking through the window. I lay still, half asleep, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound outside, like footsteps moving slowly over leaves. I thought maybe it was a deer or even a fox, since the area was full of wildlife. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard it again, closer this time, just outside the window. I turned my head toward the window, but all I could see was a faint reflection of the room in the glass. My heartbeat picked up. I told myself it was probably just an animal. After a minute or two, the sound stopped. I eventually managed to fall asleep again, though it took a while. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The ground near the window was covered in damp leaves, but I noticed a patch of flattened grass that looked like someone, or something, had stood there. The footprints weren't clear enough to tell, but it made me uneasy. I brushed it off and spent most of the day reading inside while the weather turned cloudy and gray. That evening, I decided to walk to a small clearing I had passed the day before. I took my flashlight even though it wasn't dark yet. The air felt heavier than usual, and the forest seemed strangely quiet. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I walked for about 15 minutes when I saw something in the distance. Someone standing between the trees. At first, I thought it might be another hiker, but something about the stillness of that figure made me stop. The person didn't move, didn't even seem to be breathing. I narrowed my eyes, trying to make out what I was seeing. It looked like a woman, tall and thin, wearing a long gray coat that reached her ankles. Her hair looked long and dark, but it was hard to tell from that distance. She was just standing there, facing me but not moving at all. I froze for a moment, unsure what to do. The rational part of my mind told me it was just someone passing through the woods. But there was something about the way she stood there, perfectly still, that made my skin crawl. I took a step back, then turned and started walking quickly back toward the cabin. I didn't look back, but the entire time I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching me. When I got back to the cabin, it was already getting dark. I locked the door, lit a small lantern, and tried to calm down. I kept telling myself that it was just a local woman, maybe walking or foraging. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I barely ate dinner that night and ended up going to bed early. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept waking up at small noises, the creak of the wood, the faint rustle of branches outside. Sometime around 2 in the morning, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, but a slow dragging sound across the porch. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. Then I heard it again, this time at the window, the faint scrape of a hand or something brushing the glass. I didn't move. I just lay there staring at the dark ceiling, feeling my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I wanted to look, but I couldn't bring myself to. After what felt like forever, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When daylight finally came, I checked the porch. There were faint marks on the wooden planks, muddy smears that looked like footprints but longer, like someone had been dragging their foot. I didn't know what to make of it. I decided I'd leave the next morning instead of staying the full 3 days. I didn't want to risk running into whoever that woman was. The rest of the day was quiet, but I kept catching myself looking at the window, half expecting to see someone there. Around dusk, fog began to roll in from the woods, covering everything in a pale haze. That night, I stayed fully dressed, ready to leave if I had to. I sat up reading with the lantern beside me, trying to ignore the noises outside. Around midnight, I heard something again, soft footsteps in the wet grass, moving toward the cabin. My throat went dry. I slowly reached over and turned the lantern off. The footsteps got closer, and then there was silence. I waited, barely breathing. Then, through the faint moonlight, I saw a shadow pass across the window. I could see her now, her face pale, her eyes wide and empty-looking, pressed close to the glass as if she was trying to see inside. I froze completely. She didn't move, didn't blink. She just stared through the window for what felt like a full minute. And then, just as slowly, she turned and walked back into the fog. I didn't sleep that night either. The moment daylight broke, I packed everything and left. The ground was soaked, and the fog still hung low, but I didn't care. I drove down the muddy road as fast as I could without getting stuck. Later, when I reached the nearest petrol station, I told the clerk that I'd seen someone wandering near the forest. He looked at me strangely and said that sometimes people came up there looking for old ruins or abandoned camps, but he didn't know of anyone living nearby. He said a few hikers had reported seeing a woman wandering near the woods years ago, but she disappeared after a storm in 2010. I didn't ask anything else. I just nodded, filled up my car, and left. Even now, years later, I can still picture her face in the window, expressionless, pale, and silent. I've never gone back to that part of the country. Sometimes, when I see fog rolling through the trees or hear the crunch of leaves outside my house, it takes me right back to that night. It's strange how something so simple, a weekend alone in a cabin, can stay with you forever. I never found out who she was or what she wanted, but I know what I saw. She was real, and sometimes that's the part that scares me the most. It was late October of 2019 when I drove out to a rented cabin near the edge of the Kaibab National Forest in northern Arizona. I was 32 at the time, worn out from work, and needed a break from everything. The cabin was old but cheap, sitting a few miles from the nearest paved road. I'd found it on a rental website, and the owner said hunters used it sometimes. It looked simple enough in the photos, just a wooden cabin with a metal roof, one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a porch that faced the thick woods. I brought my dog, Max, a big mixed breed who'd never left my side since I'd adopted him 4 years earlier. The drive there was long and quiet. The deeper I went into the woods, the less cell signal I had. By the time I reached the cabin, the signal was gone completely. I didn't mind much. That was part of the reason I came, to disconnect. The air was cold and sharp. The trees swayed heavy with the sound of wind pushing through dry leaves. The cabin was rough looking up close, the wood darkened by age and weather. One of the steps up to the porch was cracked, and the windows had faint smudges of dirt that no one had bothered to clean. There were no neighbors in sight, no vehicles on the dirt road behind me, just quiet forest stretching out endlessly. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. There was a wood stove in one corner, a small table, and a single bed with a wool blanket. I unpacked, fed Max, and started a fire in the stove. As night fell, I sat on the porch with a flashlight, just listening to the forest. The woods at night had a strange rhythm, rustling leaves, distant cracking sounds, the occasional snap of a branch. I figured it was animals, maybe deer or coyotes. Max's ears kept twitching toward the trees, but he stayed calm enough that I didn't think much of it. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of Max growling. It wasn't loud, but it was deep and steady. I lifted my head and saw him standing near the door, his fur raised along his back. I listened, trying to catch any sound outside, but all I heard was the wind pressing against the cabin walls. I told myself he must have heard an animal nearby. Still, I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and looked out the window. At first, there was nothing, just the pale beam of light cutting through the trees. Then I saw something move between the pines, maybe 50 yards away. It was quick, but it didn't move like a deer. It moved lower, more controlled. I stood there for a few seconds, flashlight shaking in my hand. Whatever it was stopped behind a tree. I could make out the faint outline of something tall but not quite right in shape. I told myself it was a trick of the light and forced myself to go back to bed. The next morning, I walked out to where I thought I saw it. The ground was hard, but there were faint marks in the dirt. Prints that looked almost human, but longer, and the toes were spread strangely. Max sniffed around, whining softly. I tried to think logically. Maybe someone had been out there, maybe a hunter or a hiker, though the nearest trail was miles away. Still, the shape of those prints bothered me. That day passed quietly. I chopped some firewood, cooked simple food, and took Max for a walk along the edge of the forest. The deeper we went, the quieter everything got. It wasn't the normal, peaceful silence. It was like the woods were holding their breath. No birds, no wind, just stillness. I started feeling uneasy, and Max kept looking behind us as we walked back. That night, things got worse. Around 1 a.m, I heard something walking around the cabin. Not running, just slow, careful steps. Max growled again, low and constant. The fire had burned low, so the room was dark except for the red glow from the stove. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps circled once, then stopped near the porch. I didn't move. I could hear breathing, faint but clear, right outside the door. Then came a scratching sound, like fingers dragging lightly along the wood. Every part of me wanted to open the door and yell, but something in my gut told me not to move. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the door, waiting. Eventually, I must have drifted into a half-sleep. When I woke up again, the sun was coming through the window, and Max was still by the door, watching. When I stepped outside, there were tracks again in the dirt. More of them this time. They led from the woods straight to the porch. I could see where something had crouched low near the steps. The prints were clearer now. They were human-like but bent wrong. The heel too narrow, the toes almost clawed. It looked like someone had been barefoot in the freezing dirt. I thought about packing up and leaving that morning, but I told myself I was just overreacting. Maybe it was an animal with a weird gait. Maybe I was letting my imagination get to me, so I stayed. I wish I hadn't. That evening, just as the sun dropped behind the trees, Max started acting strange again. He kept staring toward the tree line, whining quietly. I looked out and saw nothing, but I could feel something was off. The air felt heavier. I decided to bring Max inside early, locked the door, and added more wood to the fire. I sat by the window watching until it got completely dark. Around midnight, I heard something again. This time, closer, heavier. It wasn't walking now. It was dragging its feet, slow and uneven, circling the cabin. I froze. Max stood stiff beside me, teeth bared, his tail straight up. The sound stopped for a few seconds, and then I heard a noise that made my stomach drop. A sound like a voice, but not right. It was trying to mimic something, like a human tone but twisted, too low and too broken. It wasn't saying anything clear, just a sound that felt like it came from somewhere deep in the throat. I turned off my flashlight and just listened, holding my breath. The sound moved to the side window. I didn't look, couldn't. Then came the scratching again, this time higher up, across the glass. That was it for me. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and Max's leash. I waited, trying to time it when the sound shifted to the back of the cabin. I opened the front door quietly and stepped onto the porch. The cold air hit me hard. Max was pulling forward, ears flat, muscles tense. I didn't look back. I went straight for the truck, heart pounding so loud I could barely think. I drove down that dirt road faster than I should have. In the rearview mirror, I caught one glimpse of something at the edge of the headlights. It was standing near the trees, thin, tall, skin stretched tight, like it didn't fit its own body. The way it stood wasn't natural. Its arms hung too low, and the head tilted slightly, like it was watching. I didn't slow down to look again. By the time I reached the paved road, the forest was gone behind me, just darkness fading in the distance. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station nearly an hour later. Inside, I finally caught my breath. Max was shaking beside me, still growling softly at the empty parking lot. I never went back for the rest of my things. I called the owner the next day, told him I'd left early, and mailed the keys from town. He didn't ask questions. It's been years since that night, but sometimes, when I walk my dog late or drive through quiet rural areas, I get that same cold feeling in my chest, that sense that something's watching from the dark, just waiting. I never figured out what it was near that cabin. Maybe it was a person, maybe not, but I know what I saw, and I know the sound it made wasn't human. And I'll never forget those prints in the dirt, bare, long, and wrong in every way a human footprint can be. It was late October of 2016 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone at my uncle's old farm in southern Iowa. The place had been empty for almost 2 years after he passed, and my aunt had asked me to go down and check on it, make sure no one had broken in or stolen anything. She was planning to sell it soon, but the property was too far out and too quiet for her to deal with anymore. I was 29 at the time, working remotely, and I figured a few weeks of peace might do me some good. The farm sat about 8 miles from the nearest town, hidden behind fields of dead corn and gravel roads that didn't even show up properly on GPS. The first time I saw the cabin from the dirt road, it looked smaller than I remembered. It wasn't really a cabin in the traditional sense. It was an old farmhouse, wooden siding painted white once, but now weathered gray. The roof was sagging a bit in the middle, and one of the upstairs windows had a crack across the glass. I parked my old Chevy next to the barn and just sat there for a while, listening to the dry wind moving through the corn stalks. Everything felt unnaturally still. No birds, no insects, just the faint creaking of wood from the barn and the distant hum of wind turbines miles away. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust. My uncle had left everything as it was. The old recliner still next to the small wood stove, a rusted lamp on a side table, and his boots by the door. The smell of stale air and old smoke hung around like it had been trapped for years. I opened the windows to let some air in, and a few flies started buzzing from somewhere in the kitchen. The floors creaked under my boots with each step. I checked every room out of habit: the small bedroom with the iron bed frame, the kitchen with its cracked sink, and the cellar door in the corner near the pantry. That cellar door gave me a strange feeling right away. It was heavy, reinforced with a steel latch, which seemed strange for a farm cellar. I spent most of the first evening cleaning, dusting shelves, wiping counters, trying to make the place livable. The water still worked, though it came out brown for the first minute. I had brought my own food and some bottled water just in case. The sun went down early, and once the light was gone, it got cold fast. I lit a fire in the stove, and for a while it felt cozy, quiet, but peaceful. I ate, read a bit, and went to bed. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, but sharp enough to pull me out of sleep. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in silence. I listened, footsteps, slow, crunching on the gravel near the side of the cabin. I stayed still, thinking maybe it was a raccoon or a deer, but the steps stopped right outside the window. The air felt colder all of a sudden, even though the fire in the stove was still glowing. I didn't move, just waited, listening. After a minute, the sound faded away toward the barn. In the morning, I walked outside and found faint shoe prints in the dirt. Not boots, not animal tracks, shoes. Human ones. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe someone from a nearby farm had come through, maybe even a hunter who got lost. But the tracks led from the road straight toward the cabin and then around the back, disappearing near the barn. That didn't feel random. I didn't tell anyone. I just kept my head down and went about the day. I checked the barn later that afternoon. The doors were half open, swinging a bit from the wind. Inside, it smelled of mold and old hay. Dust coated everything. There were tools on the wall, rusted pliers, saws, shovels, all untouched. But there was also something I didn't remember from before. A pile of blankets near the back wall, flattened like someone had been sleeping on them. Next to it, a half-empty water bottle and a plastic bag with what looked like old food wrappers. Someone had definitely been living there. That night, I locked every door and window before sleeping. I even wedged a chair under the door handle just to be sure. I kept a flashlight and a small knife next to my bed. The wind outside picked up again, rattling the thin window panes. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to another sound. The door handle moving, gently, just the soft click of metal shifting. My body froze completely. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The sound stopped after a few seconds, but I didn't move until dawn. When I checked the door in the morning, the chair was still in place, but the outside doorknob had a fresh smear of dirt on it, like someone had gripped it with muddy hands. I thought about leaving that day, but the nearest gas station was miles away, and my truck had barely a quarter tank. I figured I'd wait one more night and leave early in the morning. I spent the day inside, trying not to think about it. The light through the windows looked colder than usual, and even the air seemed heavy. Late afternoon, I went out to the barn again, trying to confirm what I'd seen. The pile of blankets was still there, but this time they were spread out differently, like someone had recently used them. There was also a torn piece of paper tucked under one of the blankets, folded up several times. I opened it, and it just said asterisk, "Stay out of the cellar." Asterisk, I dropped it right there. My uncle never mentioned anything about the cellar, and I never remembered it being locked when I was a kid. I went back inside, stood staring at that heavy door for a while. The metal latch was shut tight, but I noticed something strange about it. There were fresh scratches around the lock, like someone had been trying to pry it open with a tool. I decided I wasn't sleeping there another night. I packed my things, loaded them into the truck, and went back to do one last check before leaving. That's when I saw something that froze me completely. Near the cellar door, the wood on the floor was marked. Long drag marks, faint but visible, leading from the front of the kitchen toward the cellar. It looked like someone had dragged something heavy. Maybe a sack, maybe a body. I couldn't tell. The marks disappeared right at the edge of the cellar door. I went cold all over. I tried to convince myself maybe it was old, maybe something my uncle had done years back when he was storing tools. But the marks were fresh, clean against the dusty floorboards. I didn't touch the latch, didn't open the door. I just backed out slowly, locked up, and got into my truck. When I pulled onto the dirt road, I looked back once more. The cabin sat there in the fading light, silent and small, the barn behind it casting a long shadow across the field. I drove until I hit the main road and didn't stop until I reached town. I filled up the tank, got a motel for the night, and tried to forget about it. A week later, I got a call from my aunt. She told me the sheriff had gone out to the property after a neighbor reported seeing smoke from the chimney again. They found signs that someone had been staying there: food wrappers, footprints, a pile of blankets. But the real part that made my stomach twist was what they found in the cellar. According to the report, there were old canned goods, tools, and in the corner, a makeshift bed made of rags. The sheriff said it looked like someone had been living down there for months, maybe years. Whoever it was had been hiding there long before I arrived, and probably during the nights I slept upstairs. They never caught whoever it was. They said the person likely left after seeing the truck gone for good. The door latch had been broken from the inside. I never went back. My aunt sold the property within a few months, and I didn't ask who bought it. Sometimes, when I think about that week, I remember lying in that bed, listening to the quiet, and realizing that maybe the footsteps I'd heard those nights hadn't come from outside the cabin at all. Sometimes I wonder if that cellar door had always been closed, or if it had been opened once just quietly enough while I was sleeping.